Hello. So this is our origin of life, history of Earth quickie. I can tell you love my seafoam green headphones. My earbuds were starting to bother me because I have a zit inside of my ear. Um, yeah, that doesn't go away after you turn 40. Stuff like that. It's good times. Anyway, so I stole my kids' headphones. These belong to my kindergartner. Anyway, uh, okay, so this is going to be quick because there's really not that much here. We're just kind of wrapping up, like putting a bow on evolution. One of the last things we need to talk about is we need to talk a little bit about the history of the Earth, but we really need to talk about how did life start, right? Because that's, okay, we've talked about how it changes and we've talked about that on a small scale, we've talked about that on a big scale, but like, how did it start? That's the real question. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do. Oh, that's a beautiful picture of the Earth forming about 4.6 billion years ago. And so there's a cool little YouTube video that I linked in the page where you found this about that. So I'm not going to get into too much about how they calculated that. But there it is. Okay, so Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. Okay, now this is actually, I went back a slide on the PowerPoint. So this is a phylogenetic tree, right? We talked about those in the last topic when we were talking about macroevolution. But what I wanted to look at is this one has a time scale attached, which I think is pretty cool, right? So it separates everybody by, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, right? And it's only the really large branches of the family tree, as it were. And so this time scale is kind of nice, right? So origin of Earth, actually, we now know it was more like this instead of, that's a 6. Okay. And so in the beginning, Earth was still like molten, man. It was like that, right? It took a long time for it to kind of cool and form a crust, right? That actually, was solid. But believe it or not, fairly shortly thereafter, you can see this line kind of fades because we don't know exactly when the first life forms appeared, but we do have a date for some that are 3.5 billion years old. Okay, so we don't know when the very first ones were, but we know that at least 3.5 billion years ago. We have some fossils of some of our simplest organisms. So I'm actually going to skip around a little bit. So here's some of these fossilized guys, right? Not super impressive. Right? And once again, we know that they are the age that they are because of radiometric dating, right? And remember, when we're not talking, we know how old they are to the day, right? It's like geologic time scale, okay? And when we look at some of these, essentially what these are like microscopically thin slices through rocks, and you can actually see things that can't be a result of like crystal formation, right? They have to be cells of some kind because of the way they're organized, right? Because remember, one of the characteristics of life is ordered structures, yeah, that are really kind of different from like crystals or things like that. Okay, so anyway, so that's the evidence that goes back there. So we'll finish looking at our timeline, and then we'll talk about how it probably happened. Okay, we didn't start getting a lot of diversity until, where is that? 2.8 billion years ago or so, right? Is when we start to see fossils that show that there's a little bit more diversity. Okay, the earliest animals are, that's 570 million years ago, 575 million years ago, I think, to be more precise. Okay, right? So so Earth is very, very old, and when you think about it, if you think about how old the Earth is, life as we know it is only incredibly recent, okay? So you don't need to memorize these dates, but it's kind of a nice thing to look at to kind of get a feel for how, you know, deep time, right? What does it mean when we say, you know, the oldest organisms, right? What are we really talking about? Okay, so we have, hey, Superstar, can you quiet it down a little, please? Dakin, please, a little bit quieter, please. He's playing a video game. I don't know if you guys, I don't know if the mic is picking this up. He's like dancing and singing. It's adorable, but anyway. Oh my gosh, this is such a hot mess. Okay, so we don't know, we know for sure that life at some point appeared on Earth because it's here now. We don't, and we have an idea of when, right? We have a pretty good idea of when. We don't know exactly how. There are a lot of indicators that kind of lead us to various hypotheses about how life started. I wouldn't say any of these things rise to the level of theory, though, because there's a lot of, how do I want to say this? There's evidence to support that life could have arisen in some of these ways that we're going to talk about, but there isn't evidence to support that it in fact did, if that makes any sense. Okay, so right, with that, let's just jump into some of this. Okay, so there are a bunch of different hypotheses about how life started. There's one that's really the one that most people, you know, kind of feel the most like, yeah, it's probably that one. Okay, and it's like a 4-point like process, right, to get us to from non-living to living things. Okay, now some of this isn't going to make too much sense because of the order in which we're covering material, because I'm weird and I do it that way. So some of this stuff right now, you're going to be like, I don't really know what that is, but we'll learn more about it later. Okay, so just kind of bear with me for that. All right, so what was early Earth like? We know what early Earth was like because there are still old rocks, right? And so those old rocks give us an idea of, you know, chemical composition and what was the pH like? Was it super acidic? Was it basic? What was it? You know, all kinds of, you know, old rocks give you all kinds of information about what the environment was likely like back in sort of the early stages. One thing is for sure is that it was very hot. There was a lot of geologic activity, lots of volcanoes and things like that, because, you know, the Earth was still cooling, right? It was still like, it wasn't even completely fully formed yet. There were a lot of gases in the atmosphere that aren't super common now. So oxygen is now relatively more common in the environment than it was back then in the air. Okay, so lots of carbon dioxide, lots of nitrogen, lots of methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide. That's that rotten egg smell, right? So that rotten egg stinky, you know what I'm talking about, that farty smell. Okay, that's hydrogen sulfide. So it was like, it was nasty. It was not very friendly place. Okay, real hot, gross. Okay, lots of electrical storms, right? And just, you know, as the atmosphere was building up, it was a really like inhospitable place. Okay, so the 4 steps. So this 4-step hypothesis for the origin of life. Like I said, this is kind of the one that most people, you know, are currently thinking, yeah, that probably makes sense. The first step is, if you are going to have living things, the very first thing that you need to have is you need to have organic molecules. So the term organic at the grocery store means something different than the term organic when we're talking about chemistry and biology. So organic in this case means carbon-based molecules, generally large molecules, that are typically almost always only created in living things inside of cells. Okay. And so where did the first of these molecules come from? These simple organic compounds. So in the 50s, a guy named Stanley Miller, and what's really interesting is that he was a student at the time. When he was first started doing this research, he had finished his bachelor's degree and he was, you know, pursuing his PhD. So he was a young dude, right? He was like in his very early 20s, right, when he was doing this. And so he and his advisor, Harold Urey, you know, basically what they did is they thought, okay, we're going to make like a system, a closed system, and we're going to set it up with all the stuff that we think early Earth is like. And then we're just going to like let it go and see what happens. Okay. And so I included a link to a adorable little video that, you know, really, I think very clearly explains this. In a way that I think will be really useful for you. So I'm just going to let you watch that to get the details out of it. Okay. But essentially, right, they set up this system. It had water. It had an area that was heated and an area that was allowed to cool, because there were likely temperature fluctuations, just like there are, you know, now in different parts of the Earth. There were sparks to represent like lightning or electrical activity. Okay. And basically he started this with chemicals that were fairly certain were around in the beginning, right? So hydrogen, methane, ammonia, stuff like that. And he let it run for a while. And he found out that actually in a very short period of time, spontaneously, certain small organic molecules formed. Right? Since then, and this is one of the cool things in the video, since then, other people, I mean, you know, this was 1953, so this is a long time ago, right? Since then, people have run variations on this experiment, okay, and have been able to produce completely abiotically, completely outside of cells, essentially all of the organic building blocks of life independently. Right? Which is pretty cool. Okay. So the idea is that we don't know for sure because we don't have direct evidence that this happened, but it's entirely possible that it could have based on the evidence that's, you know, been seen in these different experiments. Okay. So that's the first step, is the origin of these small, tiny, tiny little organic molecules. Okay. The second step, I don't have a slide for. The second step, I should be writing this down. Abiotic synthesis. Synthesis is just a fancy name for making of small organic molecules, right? And that's Harold and Urey. Okay. Step 2, abiotic synthesis. Maybe we should talk about what abiotic means. So in a previous video, I said that whenever you put a in front of a word, it means without. So abiotic means without life. So not occurring inside of a cell, but occurring, you know, outside of life. Okay. So abiotic synthesis of large chains of those organic molecules. Okay, now this one is even simpler. Okay, so like I said, you're going to watch the little video to learn more about Harold and Urey. Harold and Urey, Miller and Urey. Okay. So the idea is, and this is something that you might be familiar with if you've ever done like a project as a kid where you tried to make your own rock candy or where you tried to grow crystals. Okay. And that is, if you have a solution, right? So a dissolved solution with all kinds of different things dissolved in it. So let's use the rock candy example. Okay. So if you've ever tried to make rock candy as a kid, it's kind of easy and it's kind of not. Right? But the idea is that you make a super saturated sugar solution. So you heat up some water and you put in as much sugar as you can possibly dissolve into that water. And then basically what you do is you just let it evaporate as quickly as possible. And as the water evaporates, the sugar crystallizes and is left behind. Okay. So the idea here now, right? So in that case, you know, you've already got that molecule sugar. Okay. But the idea here is that when solutions evaporate rapidly, sometimes chemical bonds form that normally require assistance, okay? So the idea is that, and this is another one that we don't know for sure that it happened this way, but we've tested to see that it's possible. If you take a solution that contains these small organic molecules, right, dissolved in water, and you drip them onto super hot surfaces so that they evaporate like instantly, right, then oftentimes those super small molecules will form little bonds with each other to make bigger molecules, okay? So we'll talk more about that when we get to, you know, sort of chemistry and some of those things, which is going to be, that's not for a little while. So it's going to come up, but it's going to come up later. Okay, so solutions dried very quickly, right? Okay, so you're thinking, well, what does that have to do with early Earth? So remember those volcanoes, right? So it would have been very common for, you know, shallow seas and, you know, various ponds, puddles of water, right? To be around a lot of volcanic activity. And if water splashes onto, you know, lava, right? That's super hot. It's going to evaporate. It's going to like sizzle instantly, right? And so doing that, if you drip solutions on molten hot rock, right, it does that no problem. Okay, so that's how we got these larger organic molecules. That's step 2. Okay, step 3. Once RNA existed, right? So this is step 3. That kind of set the stage for genes, okay? We have not talked about RNA yet. We're not going to for a little while, okay? So for now, you're like, what's RNA? RNA is a lot like DNA in that it is a molecule that carries genetic information, okay? The cool thing about RNA is that if RNA developed, right, if it formed spontaneously because of steps 1 and step 2, okay, what RNA does that's cool is it spontaneously replicates itself, right? And so origin of self-replicating molecules, okay? So it spontaneously copies itself, basically, okay? And so for right now, that doesn't make any sense, but it will make sense when we talk about the structure of DNA and the structure of RNA, okay? So more detail on that is coming up, but the idea is that the third step is you need some kind of genetic material, because essentially that's like, you know, the kernel of what life is genetic instructions determining what a cell should be, right? So that was like the third step, okay? So organic development of abiotic, development of smaller organic molecules, bigger organic molecules, self-replicating molecules, specifically RNA, okay? And then the last step is, the other thing that you know that life always has, is life is made of cells, right? And so this is another one that this isn't going to make a ton of sense until we talk about some of the chemistry kind of topics a little bit more. So this will come up again later, but essentially there are these types of molecules that are called phospholipids, and don't worry too much about that right now. But what phospholipids do that's really, really interesting is if you put them in water, they spontaneously form like a membrane. So you see these little membranes here that they're showing, right? So the idea is that, let's say we have this, they call it a warm little pond, okay? So we have this warm little pond, and in that warm little pond, first, we have these small molecules that form. And then, you know, it gets subjected to heating and cooling and and all these things are happening. And so you get these kind of larger molecules, and some of those larger molecules might be RNA, right? And so they're able to start, you know, self-replicating and, you know, if you've got phospholipids in the mix and phospholipids are nearby, phospholipids can form a little envelope spontaneously around some of that RNA, around some of those other molecules, there you go. You have like a protocell. Okay. We can mimic all of these activities in the lab, right? And so this is kind of considered to be the most widely accepted explanation of where the first cells came from. All right. Now, and the first cells were simple, right? They were very, very simple, not much more complex than something like this. Okay. There are other hypotheses. And so I don't want to, act like the only, the one I've mentioned is the only one. It's the most widely accepted, but there's other hypotheses that explain, that suggest that there is evidence that suggests that life actually may have started elsewhere in the universe, right? Because some of those organic molecules that that I've been sort of obliquely mentioning are found on meteors, right? And are found in these like gas clouds, right? Like, out in the galaxy. So Earth is not the only place that has these organic molecules. So it's entirely possible that life didn't necessarily start here, but it like landed here, right? And when I say it that way, I'm not talking about like little green men, right? I'm talking about, something simple, like the simplest, smallest possible cells. So that's a possibility. How did it start on those other places? Well, once again, probably comes back to something that's kind of like this, okay? So I just want to be really, really clear, at risk of sounding wishy-washy, I want to be really, really clear that evolution is a theory. Tons of evidence to support it, right? Really well established. Origin of life, not a theory, right? We're not at that level. We have evidence that could suggest a bunch of possible ways that life started, but we don't know for sure right now because we don't have the type of evidence that would make that like clear, like, oh yeah, for sure that happened. Yeah, we don't have that kind of level of evidence. Okay, so I know this is kind of frustrating because some of the stuff that I mentioned isn't really stuff we know about yet, but I did want to include it here because we were talking about the evolution, right? And so I wanted to kind of have this as our wrap up. So we'll come back and talk about some of this stuff later on. So for now, if you're like, what is it, all these organic molecules and all that business, we'll get to that later, okay? So that wraps up origin of life and our entire section on evolution, okay? All righty. Have a good one. Have a lovely morning, evening, whatever you're doing right now.